Well, a very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Those who are expecting to see our wonderful Chief Executive Officer, Crispin, I'm afraid for personal reasons he's not able to join us this evening. I'm very sorry. But he and I'm Stephen Devine, I'm the principal keyboard player for the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, and also tonight's piano soloist. He and I were going to talk about what the fortepiano brings to performances of Mozart, why it's interesting, what's different about it, and so I thought we'd pretty much continue in the same vein, and I'd just give you a little overview. I'm sure many of you know, I can see one person there who definitely knows a lot about this subject, but it's sort of interesting when you sort of give a blanket overview that some things come out that people go, oh, I didn't know that, and I just hope that it might increase your enjoyment of this evening's performance. And if you have any questions about the instrument that we're using tonight, this one here, please save them up and I'll take a 5-minute question and answer at the end of this little talk. First of all, it's so wonderful to be back. It's very exciting. I'm sure it's the same for many of you as well. I understand this is the third concert back here at the Wiltshire Music Centre. This is, as I'm sure you know, one of our favourite places to play, the live acoustic, the intimacy with the audience. It's incredible. And just coming back here and rehearsing today has been a very moving experience as well, and a very special one. So I'd like to thank you all for coming out and making this event even more special for us in the OAE as well. It's really, really going to be a wonderful evening of incredible music, absolutely sensational music. So I've put two instruments on stage here. I've got the very faithful, rather small cottage Steinway that belongs here at the Wiltshire Music Centre, and I brought along this copy of a 19th century, very early 19th century Viennese fortepiano. Firstly, a little bit of history. The piano, as I say, I'm sure many of you know this, but forgive me for repeating it. The piano was invented in 1697, give or take a year or two, and it was invented by one Bartolomeo Cristofori, who was a harpsichord maker, and he wanted the harpsichord, which has the plucking mechanism, he wanted a harpsichord to have loud and soft, which a harpsichord doesn't, because the plucking mechanism, doesn't matter how hard you press the keys, it always happens at the same, the actual plucking, it happens at the same sort of velocity. So you get the same dynamic. Now, that's fine. It doesn't mean that the harpsichord's got a problem. It just means that we have to use different modes of expression on the harpsichord. So we use articulation and rubato, that's to say the amount of give and take in a rhythm to create phrasing. But it's not a non-musical instrument, it just has a different modes of expression. What Cristofori wanted to do, though, was create a harpsichord with loud and soft. And in fact, once he'd sorted out the mechanism, he actually called it that. He called it gravicembalo, harpsichord, col piano e forte, harpsichord with soft and loud. And what he did was actually quite simple. On the harpsichord, you have a quill that plucks the string, and the quill itself is mounted on an upright piece of wood called a jack. And what he did was he moved the jack so that it went underneath the string, so the jack itself actually hit the string. But he came up with a problem straight away. And this is relevant, I promise. Here's the string, here's the top of the jack. And he thought, well, first of all, you don't want it wood-covered, you want it a bit soft. So he put some nice sort of various materials. He tried lots of different experiments. On the top of the wood. And as the wood hit the string, of course, he realized that it was making contact with the string and staying in contact with the string. So it was choking the very string it was trying to excite. So what he did was then invent a mechanism whereby, as you carried on pressing the key, the hammer, the top of the jack, hit the string and then immediately came away from it, or as he called, escaped the string. So it came up and you carried on pressing and the jack just bounced away. Now, it was quite hard to control. In fact, we've got a prototype. We've got a very early instrument of his that survives, or certainly some of it survives. And we can see that it sort of works pretty well, but it's incredibly hard to control. What happens is, as the hammers hit the strings, they bounce away, and they bounce, and they shiver. And you can, when you press a note, you can get sort of 3 notes for the price of 1. So he had to discover a way of actually creating a mechanism that was so carefully controlled that you could press the note, the hammer came up and hit the string, and then escaped it, came away from it, but in a very controlled fashion. And what he came up with was so sophisticated that it's actually the basis of all modern piano actions. It's called a double escapement action. Obviously, it's gone through various modifications, but it's basically the same sort of thing. So what he came up with just by moving this harpsichord jack to underneath the string and then solve all the problems it created, was so brilliant. The problem was, like all good new inventions, especially pre-internet, no social media to spread the word and tell people what was going on, it didn't really catch on. We think Cristofori was probably a bit of a Leonardo da Vinci type character, an amazing ideas man who just came up with all this stuff. We don't know very much about him, but it didn't really catch on as an idea, although people knew about it. It was a long time before the idea of a hammer action really took on. And it took on because a group of German craftsmen escaped from the guild system in the German sort of states. Obviously, Germany wasn't really a country in the middle of the 18th century. And they came over to London, where they could actually just get on and build instruments, and they didn't have to rely on silversmiths to build certain bits, and wire drawers and metallurgists and all these different guilds to build their pianos. So they came over to London. They were called the 12 Apostles. There were 12 of them, and they created this piano industry in London. And they were quite canny because they realized that in order to catch the public's imagination, what they had to do was come up with a small, cheap version that was going to be taken up by the public. And they got it dead right. They came up with an instrument that about this size, sort of square in design, well, oblong, and they got it just right. They called it the Tafelklavier, the table piano. It got anglicized, like all these things did, and we called it the square piano. The problem is, they're never, ever square. They're always this oblong shape, but, you know, you can't have everything. Now, what was great about these was they were small, they were cheap, they were a fantastic piece of furniture because you could have the top down, and the keyboard would be hidden, and then you could use it as a table. And after dinner in your small London flat, you could then lift the lid and you had your home entertainment post-dinner system. And you could all sit round and sing songs and do what you do with pianos. And this was a great idea. The only problem was, I say problem, it wasn't really, but the fact was that this instrument had tiny little hammers and a really simple, very cheap, very easy to create mechanism. It had little hammers that were just sort of resting on the key, and as you press the key, the hammers just bounced up and hit the string and bounced away. And you had all those problems. They did bounce, and they do that, and thousands upon thousands of these instruments were made. They were incredibly popular. I'm sure everybody has grown up or seen or knows somebody who had a square piano in their house at some point. Some of them now, of course, have been converted to drinks cabinets, but, you know, that's how it goes. But certainly when I was starting out and I was quite interested in all this, nearly every antique shop you went in had a square piano tucked away in the corner in various bits of condition, you know, and it's quite incredible to just think how many of these were made. At the same time, of course, people still had their harpsichords, and they wanted, this action's a good idea. So from about, we just don't know, but from about 1670, people were creating a harpsichord-shaped instrument with this hammer action in it. But they couldn't cope with this little tiny hammers. They had to create something that had a bit more of a body of sound. So what we find from the middle of the from the 17 well, it's hard to say, as I say, 1770, let's say, for the sake of argument, were two ways of solving this grand sort of piano shape with this newfangled hammer action in. There are very, very few examples surviving from then, but these two types of instrument coexisted right to the beginning, well, almost to the 20th century in one flavor of another. One type of instrument was obviously created in London straight out of this success of the square piano, and in England they called their instruments soft louds, pianofortes. However, in Vienna, they'd taken a different approach, and I'll explain the difference in a second, but they called their instruments loud softs, fortepianos. Nowadays, we have this problem that anything that isn't a modern piano, we call a fortepiano. But technically, that's not quite true. They are different flavors, and let me explain a little bit about what they are. So this is a typical Viennese fortepiano. This is the sort of instrument Mozart would have known. I mean, I say this is a copy, a modern copy, but it's exactly the same in design. What you have, basically, is a box that contains a soundboard. It's got a keyboard at this end. I'm sorry you can't see it, but the keyboard has black and white keys the other way around, the way I'm used to it in a harpsichord. So the white notes are black, and the black notes are white. Does that make sense? Yes, you know what I mean. Anyway, so the naturals are black. And we've got 2 strings for most of the instrument and 3 strings just in the treble. Now, when I say it's just a box containing a soundboard, I literally mean that the instrument itself is actually sort of self-contained within the box. It looks as though it's all attached, and it is glued together, but the case here is just a piece of wood to cover this bit up. Now, the reason I say that is because the other type of instrument, the English piano, and that's what this is descended from, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, everything is actually mitered into the wood. So the construction of the instrument is built so that the whole thing resonates. This instrument does exactly the opposite. This instrument is designed not to resonate. It's designed to be crystal clear and crystalline, a bit like clavichords from the time. So this, you get an echo, whereas here, you don't. It's quite hard to hear, I'm sure, but you may have to take my word for it. This is a big resonating cigar box. This is an instrument within a box. Does that make sense? So that in itself is quite fundamental. It shows that the 2 types of instruments were after something very fundamentally different. The other thing that happens is inside, and again, you'll have to take my word for this, I'm afraid, but on the Viennese action, the hammers are mounted directly on the keys. That means that when I press a key, if that's the end of the key I normally press my finger, the back comes up, and the hammer, which is resting on it, is then set in motion by the key, which rises the whole thing. The back of the hammer is caught by a little beak, and it flips up and hits the string. It's then caught by a thing on some instruments called the check, which just stops it bouncing around too much, gives you a degree of control. But you control every movement of that hammer is controlled by your finger, by your exact pressure on the finger. Now, on the English instrument, and by extraction the modern instrument, which is descended from these English pianofortes, the hammers are suspended on a separate frame within the action. So you press a key, and amazingly, it's called a jack, like the harpsichord. A piece of wood comes up and hits the hammer and sets the hammer off, and the hammer then hits the string. Now, that means that there's a certain velocity you have to press on the English piano or the modern instrument, and a certain sort of action you need to use with your fingers to make the instrument play reliably. Now, on a modern instrument, that is taken to a wonderful degree so that the modern instrument feels incredible to play, and it means that everybody can make a beautiful sound on it. Not everybody does, but it is possible. It is possible for anybody to sit and play a modern instrument. This instrument is a little bit like doing something without a safety net, because notes sometimes don't sound, because you've got to balance all the hammer weights and everything like that. You're a lot more exposed on an instrument like this because of this action setup. And actually, those 2 factors together show exactly what the different aims of these 2 flavors of instruments was. The Viennese action, they went for pure clarity. They went for quality of sound. They weren't after volume or resonance. They were after the minute detail, incredible shading and things like that. The English were after volume. They were after brilliance of sound. They were after body of sound. And that's why the English instrument developed into the modern instrument we know and love today. In fact, right as sort of late as 1900, in fact, I think there's a catalogue from 1908, where Blüthner were building an instrument that didn't look dissimilar to this. And you could have either 2 actions in it, either of 2 actions. You could either have the modern English action, or you could have the old-fashioned Vienna Prellmechanik, which basically was a Viennese piano action within it. The difficulty with that is, and the reason the Viennese piano died out as an instrument that you could buy every day was because of this business that the hammer's resting on the keys. As concert halls got louder, more and more people went to concerts. Concert halls didn't get louder. Concert halls got bigger. More people came to concerts, the rise of the middle classes all through the 19th century. More and more people went to concerts. Orchestral instruments got louder. So the instruments that my wind-playing colleagues today and my string-playing colleagues today are copies of 18th, or in some cases original 18th century instruments. And these instruments were designed for concert halls about this size. They're amazing. But as more and more people sort of went to concerts and the concert halls got bigger, they needed louder instruments. So the wind instruments had to get louder. The strings, they started putting metal strings on instead of gut strings in order to create more sound. And of course the keyboards had to keep up. They had to do the same sort of thing. The Viennese action, you couldn't really make it, well, in order to make a piano louder, sorry, I'm digressing. In order to make a piano louder, you basically have to put thicker strings on the instrument and hit it harder with a bigger hammer. It's that crude. With this instrument, because the instrument is a box, it's not particularly load-bearing. That means you can't put terribly thick strings on this without the instrument folding up. You have to start reinforcing it. And you can't redo that because there's nowhere to reinforce it within the actual instrument. And you'll see instruments from 1830, 1840, which is about the biggest these Viennese pianos got. And they're not that much bigger. They look a little bit butcher and they've got slightly sort of wider wood on the side, but they're not that different. They've got a few more strings on. The other thing is you can't put huge hammers in here because they're mounted directly on the keys. And of course what that means is that it's going to get heavier under your fingers. So there's a sort of critical mass between actually what you can actually physically play and how big the hammer you can actually put in the instrument. Whereas the English instrument, with its nice suspended instrument, means that suspended action means that you can move the leverage positions all over the place. You can press the note here and have the lever up here, and you can move a much bigger hammer. So the English instrument was much better at adapting to being a louder instrument. I'm under very strict time instructions, by the way, and I can, as some people know, talk an awful lot about this, so just forgive me. But what this means is that you gain volume, but lose this special clarity that the Viennese instrument does so well. So the reason I absolutely adore playing these instruments is because it's some of those markings that we see in Mozart that always look so interesting and so fiddly and detailed and very hard to express on a modern instrument suddenly become much easier on an instrument like this. Just to take a very simple example, there's a beginning of a Mozart sonata in B flat, which starts like this. I'm sure many of you know it. Those very first notes, they sound, despite my best efforts on this, they sound like 4 equal notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. But Mozart is so specific in his markings. He writes that the first 2 notes, I won't go into exact details about the notation, but he writes that those 2 notes have to exist in a relationship where the first one is stronger than the second one, and then they have to phrase off. And the next 2 have to just phrase together and off. So all 4 notes have a different volume and a different articulation on them. Now, it is sort of okay on this, but it does sound a little, I mean, I'll do my best, but it sounds a little bit fussy. Whereas on this instrument, and you must forgive me having just played that, also, I must warn you, those of you who have a perfect pitch, this instrument is tuned at A equals 430 cycles per second. That means it's about a quarter tone flat from the modern instrument, as are all our instruments, because this is the sort of pitch, and it's the pitch that the wind instruments from the time were approximately, so it's a good sort of round thing. So if I play this one after the other, it's going to sound a bit flat. Hopefully I've talked enough now, you've forgotten the pitch. Anyway, if I play that same phrase, because it's so absolute in its damping, it just gives us that clarity. It's a bit like looking at a tapestry and you can see the stitching just a bit clearer, but with the distance, you've still got the full picture. It's much easier to see the stitching with this style of instrument. One thing I didn't mention, which I should also say as well, is that the damping system on these instruments is quite fascinating. On this instrument, we have wedge dampers. So we've got basically blocks of felt that go between the two strings. So it goes right in and stops the sound. That means if I play a chord, it's sort of almost like a vacuum afterwards. Whereas if I do the same on this has block dampers that just sit on the strings deliberately, so you get more resonance. You can really hear it, apart from the volume, but listen to the after sound. There's still that sort of drift of sound afterwards, and that's the box, it's the damping, it's all, and of course you've got 3 strings for each note as well. It's harder to make this damp absolutely precisely, and that's the point. That's what it's designed for. It's designed for resonance and volume and body of sound. And as I say, this is designed for something exactly different. There is one special effect which I use in the second movement of this wonderful concerto, and it's called a moderator, and we don't get that on a modern instrument at all. And what it does, the hammers on this instrument are covered in leather, a special type of goat skin. And you've heard the sound. But if I press the moderator, which on this instrument is operated by a knee lever, it pushes a piece of cloth, felt cloth, between the leather hammers and the strings. And here's the normal sound, and here it is with the moderator. So absolutely wonderful. This is the sound that Beethoven talks about when he talks about the Moonlight Sonata. By the way, the Moonlight Sonata, interesting piece. Beethoven writes at the top that you have to raise the dampers and leave them raised for the whole piece. Now, if you've ever done that on a modern instrument, everything gets a little bit messy after a while. Spot the harmony. I'm going to do the same on this, with that moderator in place as well, and you'll hear. It doesn't seem a problem, does it? It's a totally different game. There are so many wonderful pros and cons to both instruments, and I adore playing the modern instrument. There's something so brilliant about coming to an instrument and knowing exactly how it's going to sound. It's going to be just so great for... Just wonderful. And this is the instrument that's inspired some of the really great keyboard music of all times. But then so is this. This is the instrument that Schubert was writing for at the beginning of his life. And at the end of his life, he was writing for just a slightly bigger version of this. This is the instrument that Beethoven played until he started losing his hearing, and then Broadwood gave him an instrument, and he was using both instruments side by side. Even Mendelssohn loved these instruments. We know that when Liszt came to Vienna, he practiced in the home of Conrad Graf, one of the great Viennese piano makers, who built instruments that were bigger than this. But he loved them. He loved the quality of sound. We have letters from him saying, oh, Graf's instruments are the most astonishing instruments. They weren't loud enough for the great concert halls, but when he practiced, he chose an instrument like this. It's incredibly formidable to think of somebody like Liszt sitting down at a delicate instrument like this and playing something. But he did. We've got to adjust our feelings, and that's one of the other keys about this. We have to adjust the way we approach. We're so used to sitting, myself included, sitting at a piano recital, hearing one of our amazing concert pianists who play this instrument, and enjoying and letting the sound wash over us. With this instrument, as a listener, you have to work just a little bit harder because the sound doesn't come to you in the same way because it's not got the body of sound. But the benefits of all that clarity and all the stuff that's going on, I think, make it for a really wonderful experience, especially when we're in a hall like this, where you can hear it, you can see it, you can enjoy the same dialogue between the piano and the winds, particularly in this wonderful concerto. I think I've said quite enough for one pre-concert talk. Are there any questions? Would anybody like to ask anything? No? Hello, sir.
To what extent was piano making going on in London, and what was it sort of, and what part of town was it going on?
Well, it's a brilliant question. It was huge. It was huge. We had some enormous companies. We had Clementi, we had Broadwood, we had Longman and Brodrip, and that's just the big companies. They were employing 300, 400, 500 people. Vienna was, there's a point in about 1810, 1815, that we know that there were 300 piano makers in Vienna. There were only 286 streets in Vienna. They were all one-man bands. London was even bigger than that because they were also making the square pianos by the thousand. I think Broadwood capacity was they were making sort of 3,000 instruments a year in the 1820s. Where were they based? Well, there's actually mostly sort of in the Camden area, everywhere really, but in Camden there's a wonderful circular building that's now owned by the Easy Hotel, Easy Office Company, and you can rent out an office in it. And they've kept the original structure by which it's offices, it's a big rotunda, and there are offices all the way around, and then there's this huge central shaft. And basically what happened is the instruments, as they were created, they came down this shaft into the next floor down, so they were finished on the ground floor. There was a big crane in the middle. And so all the raw timber went to the top floor, they built the case, brought it down, put strings on it, brought it down again, put the action in, brought it down to the bottom, and finished it, and then out it went. So they're everywhere, actually. There are still examples of this. I think the Brinsmead factory is now I think it's sort of very, very, very swish apartment somewhere in Bermondsey, but as far as I know, Camden was the real hotbed of piano making. I don't know why that was, but that's my understanding. Any other questions?
When did the chapel start?
It's a really good question. I'm afraid I don't know. I know that they were certainly very active right through the sort of end of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century, and then they were taken over. And actually, they, like a lot of these famous names, they were sort of made under license by other companies. But I don't have the exact details, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. There are some wonderful books. My predecessor at the Finchcocks, I used to work at the Finchcocks collection in Kent for many years. My predecessor there, Dr. Alistair Lawrence, who still actually owns and runs the Broadwood Piano Company, it used to be in his family, he has written a number of books, and certainly one that mentions the history of the chapel company, so that would be a good way to start. Yes, sorry, there's a lady down here. I saw something. Yes? It's a good question. Because I'm doing a Mozart piano concerto, I shall say yes. But if you get me in my sort of university lecturing mode, interestingly, the earliest type of fortepiano that we have from this is about 1772. And as we know, Mozart was born in 1756. So it seems that Mozart spent half his life actually being a harpsichordist, primarily. This piece is almost certainly a piano concerto. It was written for this type of instrument. But both instruments are working in parallel all throughout this time, so I'm sure Mozart would have turned up at a concert hall and played what he had. But yes, this is the sort of instrument he knew. He didn't really know the English type of instrument at all. It was only Beethoven and Haydn who had the chance to travel a lot more who would have seen that. When Mozart came to England in 1761, 1762, 1763, it was still a harpsichord, primarily a harpsichord sort of place. Oh gosh, these are technical questions. I have to go and have a lie down. The original of this is Walter and Son. It's the Walter was Mozart's friend. This was made probably about 1803. The original of this, and the difference between this and an instrument Mozart would have known exactly is about 4 notes at the top. Mozart's instrument went up to F. This one goes up to, well, I don't know, I don't play up there because I'm playing Mozart. It goes up to C. The geography gets you sometimes because you're so used to seeing an F at the top, and then when you see a C, you say, oh, no, it's over there. And playing a modern instrument, when you've been playing one of these for a while, you've got another octave and a half at the top. It's terrifying. It's sort of get the binoculars out and find out where you're going. I don't quite know what to do with all those notes. But yeah, this is Walter and Son. So this is when his son was working for Walter, and they were working in partnership. And then the son eventually took over the whole business. I think I better stop there. I think people are going to give me dirty looks out in the behind the house. But anyway, thank you very much indeed. I hope you've enjoyed this. See you later.